Think about the last time you stood in an airport line holding that little blue booklet with the photo you hate. You guarded it like it was made of gold, because without it, you literally cannot leave your own country. Not legally anyway. Here's what almost nobody realizes. For the first 142 years of American independence, there was no law requiring you to carry a passport to leave the United States. None. With one brief exception during the Civil War, an American citizen in 1800, 1850, or 1910 could walk onto a ship bound for Liverpool or Havana with nothing in their pockets but a ticket. No document, no permission, no questions, and yet somehow the world worked. Millions of immigrants crossed the Atlantic. American tourists flooded Europe every summer. Merchants, missionaries, and fortune seekers circled the globe. An entire age of mass migration, the largest movement of human beings in history up to that point, happened largely without anyone checking papers at the American water's edge. So how? How did governments know who was coming and going? How did a banker from New York prove who he was in Paris? What was a passport even for if nobody had to have one? And why did it all end? Because it did end in 1918. And what changed that year didn't just add a line at the border. It rewired the relationship between the American citizen and the American state, quietly turning the freedom to leave into a permission you have to ask for. The story of how that happened runs through Benjamin Franklin's personal printing press in a French village, a passport that described your nose instead of showing your face, a German spy with a Nebraska accent shot at dawn in the Tower of London, and a temporary wartime law that never really died. So let me take you back to the beginning. Picture a country house in Passy, a quiet village just outside Paris, sometime around 1780. Inside, an elderly American with gout, bifocals of his own invention, and a global reputation is fussing over a small printing press he's installed in his residence. His name is Benjamin Franklin. He's America's minister to France, and among the things he's printing, alongside dinner invitations and philosophical bagatelles, are passports, not government forms, not standardized booklets, actual letters composed in elegant French, personally signed, asking anyone the traveler might encounter to let the bearer pass freely and offer them help if needed. When an American merchant or courier needed to move through a Europe at war, Franklin would essentially write him a note, one man's signature, standing in for an entire nation that barely existed yet. That's what a passport was. The word itself comes from the French passeport, literally, permission to pass through a port or through the gates of a city. In plain terms, it was a letter of safe conduct, a document that asked foreign officials, politely, not to arrest you, rob you, or conscript you. It was protection for the traveler, not surveillance of the traveler. That distinction is the hinge this whole story turns on, so keep it in mind. When the new federal government got up and running in 1789, the job of issuing passports fell to the brand new Department of State, and the documents it produced were, frankly, charming. A single large sheet of paper, some flourished script, and language that read less like a legal instrument than a letter of introduction. The Secretary of State requesting all whom it may concern to permit the bearer, a citizen of the United States, to pass freely, and to give him all lawful aid and protection. Remember that phrasing. We're going to come back to it at the very end, because it's hiding in plain sight in your pocket right now. Here's the part that sounds made up, but isn't. The federal government wasn't even the only issuer. For decades, state governors issued passports. So did city mayors. So did notaries public, the same category of official who today stamps your mortgage paperwork. There's a surviving American passport from 1807 signed not by any federal officer, but by DeWitt Clinton, the mayor of New York City. Imagine flying to Rome next month on a document signed by your mayor. That was normal. A passport was a favor a gentleman requested, not a filter a state imposed. And this wasn't sloppiness. The founders knew exactly what they were doing. They had built a republic out of people who left somewhere else, often people fleeing states that treated departure itself as suspicious, and they defined their new country against the European model, where movement was something you licensed. In much of continental Europe, ordinary people needed papers just to travel between towns. Imperial Russia ran a full internal passport system. A Russian subject needed government permission to move around inside his own empire, let alone to leave it. To Americans of the founding generation, that wasn't governance. That was a leash. So the United States simply didn't do it. There was no exit control. There was no entry control worth mentioning for most of a century either. The federal government did not stand at the water's edge asking who you were. The numbers tell you how marginal the whole passport business was. In the early and mid-1800s, the State Department was issuing passports at a rate of only a few thousand per year. Verify exact annual issuance figures against State Department records for a country whose population passed 23 million by 1850. Put that in modern terms. It's as if the entire passport-holding public of the United States could fit inside a single minor league baseball stadium with seats to spare. Everyone else who traveled, and plenty of people traveled, just went. And the passports that did exist? Since photography was either non-existent or impractical for documents, your identity was established by written description. This is where the record becomes genuinely funny. Take the 1863 passport of a Kentucky lawyer named Warner L. Underwood. It describes him as having a high forehead, blue eyes, a prominent nose, an ordinary mouth and chin, a round face, and a florid complexion. That's it. That's the security feature. A paragraph of guesswork that could describe roughly 1 out of every 5 men on any given dock in Boston. If the border official squinting at you agreed that your forehead was, in fact, medium, congratulations, you were you. It sounds absurd. But understand what it tells us. Nobody was seriously trying to verify identity, because the document wasn't for that. It was a courtesy, a convenience, a talisman for travelers heading into countries that were fussier than America was. And for roughly 7 decades, that was the entire American system. Loose, informal, half-private, and, by its own lights, working fine. Then foreign governments started complaining, and that's where the trouble began. The complaint, when it came, was about counterfeits, not of money, but of authority. By the 1840s and 1850s, European border officials were drowning in American passports issued by governors, mayors, notaries, and occasionally, people with no authority at all. A French or Prussian official looking at a paper signed by a county notary from Ohio had no way to know whether it meant anything. Some European governments began treating non-federal American passports as worthless, which left genuine American travelers stranded, detained, or shaken down. The polite fiction was collapsing under its own informality. So, in 1856, Congress finally tidied up. A law passed that Verify Act of August 18, 1856, made the Secretary of State the one and only official in the United States who could issue a passport and set a small fee for the privilege. Verify the original fee amount. For the first time, the American passport became a single, standardized federal document. But here's the critical detail most people overlook. The 1856 law centralized who could issue a passport. It said absolutely nothing about anyone needing to carry one. Getting a passport remained entirely voluntary, and most travelers didn't bother. Congress had polished the object without changing its purpose. The exit door of the United States stood exactly as open as it had in 1789. It would take a war to close it, and 5 years later, the war arrived. In the spring of 1861, the Union began coming apart, and Washington became a city gripped by a very specific fear: leakage, Confederate agents slipping north to buy supplies and gather intelligence, sympathizers carrying dispatches to Europe, where the Confederacy was desperately courting British and French recognition, couriers, smugglers, financiers, all of them moving through ports that had never asked anyone for papers in living memory. Secretary of State William H. Seward, decided the open door was a luxury the Union could no longer afford. In August 1861, his department ordered that no one would be allowed to enter or leave the United States without a passport. Verify exact date and text of the August 1861 order. Just like that, by administrative order, without any act of Congress behind it, the thing that had never existed in American life existed: an exit requirement. Think about what that means. The first American passport mandate wasn't debated on the floor of the House. It wasn't voted on. It was declared by one department in an emergency. Legal historians have pointed out ever since that the Civil War passport requirement lacked any clear statutory authority. It rested on little more than the argument that a government fighting for survival gets to improvise. And in fairness, it was fighting for survival. Enforcement, it should be said, was patchy. The northern border with Canada was thousands of miles of farmland, forest, and frozen lakes, and it stayed porous throughout the war. Draft-age men who preferred not to be drafted, newspapers called them skedaddlers, slipped into Canada in numbers no clerk with a ledger could hope to count. A determined traveler could still leave America, but for the first time, doing so without papers made him a lawbreaker rather than a free citizen exercising an unremarkable right. And then, when the war ended, something telling happened. The requirement simply faded away. The State Department relaxed and then abandoned the mandate. Verify timeline of the requirement's relaxation, reportedly beginning as early as 1862 for most travelers. And post-war America went right back to the old system. No passport needed. Door open, as if the whole episode had been a bad dream. But it hadn't been a dream. It had been a rehearsal. A precedent now existed, sitting quietly in the files. In an emergency, the executive branch could close the exits of the United States with a memo. Nobody had stopped it. Nobody had really even tested it in court. The tool went back in the drawer. But the drawer was no longer empty. Now, before we go further, we need to be honest about something, because the story of America's open borders era has an enormous asterisk on it. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, barring the immigration of Chinese laborers, the first major federal law to shut America's door on a specific nationality. And a decade later, the Geary Act of 1892 went further in a way that matters enormously for our story. It required Chinese residents already living in the United States to register with the government and carry a certificate of residence proving their right to be in the country. Within a year, those certificates required photographs. Verify photo requirement added under the 1893 McCreary Amendment. Stop and absorb that. Decades before any white American citizen was asked to carry identity papers for any reason, the United States built its first true documentary control of human movement and aimed it at one race. The era of free movement was real, but it was never free for everyone. Recent scholarship on the Exclusion Era is blunt on this point. The administrative machinery America later used to track and filter all travelers, files, photographs, certificates, interrogations at the port, was invented and field-tested on Chinese immigrants first. One man's story makes it concrete. Wong Kim Ark was born in San Francisco around 1873, above his father's shop on Sacramento Street. He was a cook. He was, by birth, as American as anyone in this story. In 1895, returning from a visit to China aboard the steamship Coptic, he was refused entry to his own country. Held aboard ship in San Francisco Bay, while the government argued that a child of Chinese parents could not truly be a citizen at all. It took 3 years and a fight all the way to the Supreme Court before the justices ruled in 1898, 6-2, that the 14th Amendment means what it says: born on American soil, American citizen. Wong Kim Ark won, but notice what his victory required: paperwork, testimony, witnesses, lawyers, years. For him, identity was never assumed. It had to be proven, to officials with the power to say no. The rest of the country would eventually learn what that felt like. It just didn't know it yet. Because across the Atlantic, the world that made passports optional was about to be shot to pieces, and the man who pulled the trigger on the paperless age, oddly enough, was carrying an American passport when he did it. His name was Karl Hans Lody, Lohd, and if you'd met him in the summer of 1914, you'd have sworn he was American. Born in Berlin in 1877, orphaned young, he'd served in the Imperial German Navy's reserve, then spent years working as a tour guide, shepherding wealthy travelers around the world. Along the way, he'd married an American woman and lived in Omaha, Nebraska, and the years in the Midwest had sanded his English down to a flat, easy, entirely convincing American accent. The marriage collapsed. Lody drifted back to Germany, and in May 1914, with Europe quietly loading its guns, German naval intelligence came calling on the divorced tour guide with the Nebraska voice. When war broke out that August, every major European power did what America had never done. It slammed its borders shut and demanded papers. France, Germany, Britain, Russia. Within weeks, the continent that had spent a century relaxing its travel controls reimposed them almost overnight. Britain rushed through a law requiring passports to carry a photograph and a physical description. Verify British Nationality and Status of Aliens Act 1914. Suddenly, documents mattered desperately, which made one particular document priceless: a genuine United States passport. America was neutral. An American could still go nearly anywhere, and German intelligence had gotten its hands on exactly that: a real U.S. passport in the name of one Charles A. Inglis. How they got it is a detail historians still tell two ways. One account says Lody obtained it from American officials in Berlin by posing as Inglis and claiming his had been lost. Another says the real Inglis submitted his passport to German authorities for a visa, and it simply never came back. Verify which account the primary sources best support. Either way, the result was the same. Lody became Inglis. And because American passports in 1914 still carried no photograph, remember that paragraph of guesswork about foreheads and complexions? There was nothing on the document to say otherwise. The faceless passport, that charming relic of a trusting age, had just become a weapon. In late August 1914, Charles Inglis, American tourist, stepped off a boat from neutral Norway and made his way to Edinburgh, where the Royal Navy's warships lay at anchor in the Firth of Forth. He rented a bicycle, he chatted with locals, he rode around the coastline counting ships, and he mailed his findings to an address in Stockholm. Cheerful, touristy letters with intelligence folded inside. What Lody didn't know was that he was already caught. Britain's brand new Counter-Espionage Bureau, the outfit that would become MI5, run by a quietly relentless officer named Vernon Kell, had identified that Stockholm address before the war as a German intelligence letterbox. Every envelope Lody mailed was being opened, read, and resealed by British censors. And here's the fascinating detail most people don't realize. At first, the British let his messages go through. Kell's men allowed Lody's early reports to reach Germany, hoping he'd lead them deeper into the German spy network. They watched an enemy agent operate on their own soil, week after after week, reading his mail like a serialized novel. Only when his reports turned genuinely dangerous, naval details Britain could not afford to let cross the North Sea, did the order go out. In early October 1914, Lodi was arrested at a hotel in Killarney, Ireland, the American passport of Charles A. Inglis among his effects. What followed became the emotional centerpiece of the whole affair. Britain put Lodi on public trial, the only public trial of a German spy Britain would hold in either World War. For 3 days at the end of October, in a London courtroom, the tour guide from Omaha stood before a military court and did something nobody expected. He told the truth. He admitted what he was. He refused to grovel, refused to implicate others, and declared that he had done what he did for his country, not for money. Even the British officers prosecuting him were visibly moved. On the morning of November 6, 1914, Lodi was led out to the rifle range at the Tower of London. Accounts of that morning record him turning to the officer escorting him and saying he supposed the officer would not care to shake hands with a spy, and the officer replying that no, he would not shake hands with a spy, but he would gladly shake hands with a brave man. Verify this exchange, which is widely reported but rests on later retellings. Then a firing squad of Grenadier Guards ended his life, the first execution carried out at the Tower of London in well over a century. Verify the commonly cited claim of roughly 150 years. Lodi was buried in an East London cemetery, but the thing he'd exposed refused to be buried with him. A neutral country's passport, blank-faced and trusting, had walked an enemy officer straight through the tightest security on earth. Every foreign ministry in the world took note, including, with acute embarrassment, the one in Washington. The American response came 6 weeks later, and it's the moment your least favorite photograph was born. On December 21, 1914, the State Department under Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan began requiring photographs on United States passport applications. After 125 years, the American passport finally got a face, and it's worth pausing on how casual the whole thing still was. Early applicants mailed in whatever photos they had lying around, snapshots and hats, family portraits, vacation poses. Verify specific early photo submission anecdotes. The strict glowering, no-smiling mugshot standard came later, but the direction of travel was set, and it only pointed one way. Because by 1915 and 1916, the paperless world was dying everywhere at once. Europe's temporary wartime passport controls hardened into permanent bureaucracies. Neutral countries tightened their own rules to match. An American could still, technically, leave the United States without a passport. The law hadn't changed, but there was almost nowhere left to arrive without one. The open door still stood, but it now opened onto a wall of other people's checkpoints. And then, in April 1917, America stopped being neutral. The United States declared war on Germany, and everything you've watched build across this story came due at once. Wartime Washington, in 1917, was a city convinced, not entirely without reason, that it was crawling with spies. German saboteurs really had blown up the Black Tom munitions depot in New York Harbor in 1916. An explosion so vast it damaged the Statue of Liberty and shattered windows across Manhattan. Congress passed the Espionage Act within months of declaring war, and in that atmosphere, the country's ancient, easygoing indifference to who crossed its borders stopped looking like liberty and started looking like negligence. So watch closely now, because this is the moment the door actually closes, and unlike Seward's wartime improvisation half a century earlier, this time it happens in the full light of law, with dates and votes and signatures. This time it's built to last. In the House of Representatives, Congressman Henry D. Flood of Virginia, chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, introduced the bill. Congress passed it, and on May 22, 1918, President Woodrow Wilson signed into law an act with a title so dry it practically dares you to ignore it. An act to prevent in time of war, departure from, or entry into the United States contrary to the public safety. History remembers it as the Travel Control Act. Its core provision said that when the United States was at war, if the president found that public safety required it, he could proclaim restrictions, and once he did, it would be unlawful for any citizen of the United States to depart from or enter the country unless he bore a valid passport. Read that again. Unlawful. For the first time in American history, a statute, not a memo, not an emergency order, but a law passed by Congress, declared that a citizen leaving his own country without government papers was committing a crime. Wilson didn't wait long. On August 8, 1918, he issued Proclamation 1473, switching the machine on. And the proclamation went further than the headline requirement in a way almost nobody remembers today. It didn't just say you needed a passport to leave. It said no citizen would even receive a passport unless it affirmatively appeared that there were adequate reasons for the journey, and that the trip wasn't prejudicial to the interests of the United States. Sit with that for a second. Not only did you need the document, you needed a reason the government found acceptable. Want to visit your dying mother in Sweden? Make your case. Business in South America? Prove it matters. The burden of proof sat on you, the citizen. The exact inversion of everything the founders' open door had implied. The freedom to leave had formally become a permission you had to ask for. I told you at the start we'd watch that sentence come true. This is the moment it did. August 8, 1918. 3 months later, on November 11, 1918, the guns fell silent in Europe. The war was over. And here's where you'd expect the story to repeat itself. Emergency ends, requirement fades, door swings open again, just like 1865. It didn't happen. The armistice came and went, and the passport requirement stayed. In August 1919, 9 full months after the fighting stopped, Wilson sent Congress a message, forwarding his Secretary of State's request that the passport control system be extended for a year beyond the formal conclusion of peace. The emergency was over. The appetite for control was not. The requirement finally lapsed on March 3, 1921, the very last day of the Wilson administration, nearly 2.5 years after the last shot was fired. And even then, look at what lapsed actually meant. The Travel Control Act itself never went anywhere. It stayed on the books, a loaded mechanism waiting for a president and a war. The 1920s brought a superficial return to the old freedom. Americans could once again leave without papers, but the world had permanently changed around them. In 1920, a League of Nations conference in Paris standardized what a passport should even be. The little booklet format, the layout, the categories of information, verify details of the 1920 Paris Conference on passports. The modern passport was now an international system, a global grammar of identity, and no single country, not even a reluctant one, could really opt out of it. In 1926, Congress passed a new Passport Act tidying up the administrative rules. The infrastructure kept thickening, quietly, all through the supposedly carefree 20s and 30s. Then history repeated its punchline. In June 1941, with the Second World War burning and America edging toward it, Congress amended the old 1918 Act and the passport requirement snapped back into force. Verify exact provisions of the June 1941 amendment. And this time, this is the part that should raise the hair on your neck a little, it never left. The Second World War ended. The requirement rolled on under proclaimed national emergencies. In 1952, the Immigration and Nationality Act carried the rule into the modern legal code. And in 1978, Congress quietly finished the job, amending the law so the passport requirement no longer depended on war or emergency at all. Verify the 1978 amendment. It simply was. It is the law today, Title 8, Section 1185 of the U.S. Code, and it applies to you. Trace the arc one more time, because it's the whole video in miniature. A wartime emergency measure in 1861 that faded. A wartime emergency measure in 1918 that lingered for years. A wartime emergency measure in 1941 that never ended at all. Each cycle, the temporary, got a little less temporary, until the emergency became the furniture. Were the men who built this system wrong? Honestly, no, not entirely. The world of 1789 was gone. Lodi had proved that an anonymous border was a genuine national vulnerability in an age of industrial war, and every serious country on Earth reached the same conclusion within the same decade. An America with open exits in the 20th century would have been an outlier bordering on an experiment. But the skeptics were right about something too, something the record backs to the letter. They warned that emergency powers over movement, once granted, would never be fully surrendered. And they never were. Both things are true at once. That's what makes this history instead of a morality play. When you zoom out and look at this whole arc, from Franklin's hand-printed letters in passé to the biometric chip embedded in the cover of your booklet, one theme runs through all of it. The border stopped being a place and became a document. For America's first century, the border was geography, water mostly. If you could reach the far side of it, you were, for most practical purposes, gone or arrived. Today, the border is a piece of paper, really, a database entry the paper merely represents, and it travels with you everywhere. You carry the checkpoint in your jacket pocket. And something subtler happened along the way, something Wong Kim Ark understood in 1895, long before the rest of the country did. Your identity itself became something the state certifies, rather than something you simply have. In 1850, an American was an American because he said so and lived like one. Today, you are who your documents say you are, and when the paperwork and the person disagree, it is rarely the paperwork that loses. That's the deep rewiring of 1918, not a line at the airport, a quiet transfer of ownership over the proof of who you are. Which brings us back to that little blue booklet from the beginning of this story, because it's the direct descendant of everything you've just watched. The photograph in it exists because a man with a Nebraska accent was shot at the Tower of London in 1914. The legal requirement to carry it exists because a wartime statute from May 1918 proved impossible to kill. Even its physical shape traces back to that League of Nations conference in 1920, and if you actually open it and read the first page, most people never do, you'll find the ghost of Benjamin Franklin's courtesy letter still there. The Secretary of State of the United States of America, it says, hereby requests all whom it may concern to permit the citizen named herein to pass without delay or hindrance. Verify exact current wording. It's still phrased as a polite request between gentlemen 2.5 centuries later, the velvet language of the old world, wrapped around the steel requirement of the new one. The courtesy became compulsory and kept the courtesy's voice. So, was the old world better? Careful. It's tempting to romanticize the age when an American could walk onto a ship with nothing but a ticket. And there was real, breathing freedom in that. But that same world had no reliable way to protect a traveler whose face didn't match a stranger's guesswork description, no defense against a Lodi, and, as the Chinese Exclusion Era proved, no principle stopping it from imposing brutal documentary control on the people with the least power to object, while everyone else sailed free. The open door was never open equally. Whether that world was better or worse than ours depends entirely on what you value, a world that trusts you and cannot protect you, or a world that protects you and does not trust you. Reasonable people land in different places. The point of this story isn't to pick for you, it's that almost nobody remembers a choice was ever made. And that leaves the question this whole story has been circling since Franklin inked his press in Passy, the question that hasn't been resolved in 250 years and won't be resolved tomorrow. Who owns your identity? If leaving your own country requires the state's permission it grants generously today but grants, then is the freedom to leave a right you hold or a privilege you're extended? In 1918, in an emergency, America answered that question one way, quietly, and never really revisited it. Every renewal fee you pay is a small, unread receipt for that decision. If this story changed the way you look at that booklet in your drawer, subscribe to the channel. This is what we do here. We dig into the hidden systems that shape your world, the laws, documents, and institutions you were born inside and never got to vote on, and we trace where they actually came from. If you're the kind of person who wants to know how the machine was built, you'll be at home here. And next time, the passport was only half the machine. In 1924, America built the other half, because for its entire first century and a half, the United States had no border patrol at all. That story is coming soon, and you will not want to miss it.